Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Cooper and Cary Have Words. My name's Barry Cooper. I am living in DeLand, Florida, which is about 4,000 miles away from my very good friend James Cary, who's in Yeovil, England. How is Yeovil looking, James?
Yeovil's looking dark because the nights are drawing in. So here we are in Somerset, but it's very exciting. We've got a guest who is from the land where darkness gets even darker, but he currently lives in London. Barry, why don't you introduce our special guest?
Yeah, we spoke to Ali before in episodes 22 and 23. One episode is called The Art is Fine, and the other episode is called Prone to Moan. That was all the way back in March and April 2018.
It's 100 episodes ago.
You're right, 100 episodes, exactly 100 episodes. Good spot. If you want to listen to those episodes, you have to be a patron to listen to those. They're in the archive, but well worth digging out. Ali is a fine artist. Alastair Gordon, to give him his full name. I just realised I haven't done that. Ali is a fine artist. I'd say he was much better than fine, but he's humble like that. How would you describe what you do, Ali?
Hi guys. I was wondering how that was going to go in there. Yeah, when people say you're a fine artist, it does sound a bit pretentious. It makes you think, well, what are the other guys like? You know, if you're the fine ones, are they the rough ones?
Right. We describe ourselves as fine podcasters. That's what we have on our business cards. So yeah.
That works. Yes. Yeah. How would I describe myself? Well, I'm a painter. I'm sitting in my studio right now. So I'm coming to you from South London in my studio. Likewise, very dark outside. And I make paintings that fall into a tradition commonly known as trompe-l'oeil, from the French, trick of the eye. So they are illusionistic paintings.
And why were you drawn to that, or does the medium choose you?
There's a little bit of that, yeah. You sort of fall into these things. I fell into trompe-l'oeil painting about 13 years ago, and was making a series of paintings about a group of sailors in East London, and I started making pictures of their artefacts and of them, things like nautical maps and their Bibles and their little devotional materials and things like that. And I painted them to look like they'd sort of been stuck onto these wooden boards. And someone wrote a review for that exhibition, and they said Alastair Gordon refers to the trompe-l'oeil genre, and specifically the quodlibet genre of trompe-l'oeil. And I read it and I thought, what the monkeys is quodlibet trompe-l'oeil genre? So someone got there before me and told me what I did. And then I realised, oh, that's good. Yes, I could do that. And then I looked into it more, and trompe-l'oeil, it's about what's real, what's fake, what's true, what's not true, how we see the world, how we perceive perspective and things like that. And I thought, Christianly, I can have a few things to think and say about that, particularly about the nature of reality and how we see the world. So a combination of falling into things, spirit leading things just landing well, and then lots of hours of hard graft in the studio trying to get it right.
So you're creating images then. What I'm hearing you say, Ali, is you're creating images which are trying to trick the viewer almost into seeing something that isn't, seeing something as real that isn't real. I mean, that seems like a crazy, ridiculous, and positively ungodly thing for a Christian to do, doesn't it? I mean, if you're basically lying to people, aren't you?
I had an exhibition a couple of weeks ago, and at the opening night, someone said, "You're just basically lying to us, aren't you?" This person, not a Christian.
What did you say to that?
Yeah, well, I took a moment to pause.
Well, the Christians would have said it. It's just the Christians are too nice to say it. They're all thinking this lying liar is a liar, but it takes an unbeliever to go, "What is it with these lies?"
They're just
blame yourself.
Yeah, they're just too polite to say it. I think they've all been thinking it, but it took this one fella to actually say it. And, I said, I refer to the tradition of trompe-l'oeil quodlibet painting, sir.
In your face.
Yeah, and that flummoxed things for a little bit of time, so that bought me a little bit of time. But actually, we then had this little chat.
Yes, lying is a noble tradition, I'll have you know.
Well, what is the art, if not, glorified lies? It sort of comes back to, the truth but told through a noble lie. And the tradition of trompe-l'oeil is within that element, Trompe-l'oeil works at its best when the lie's exposed. So you get it really close to the painting, and you go, of course, that's not a window, or that's not a curtain, or in my case, that's not a bit of masking tape or a paper aeroplane. Of course, it's a painting. Aha! It's like that moment in. Did you guys watch Ferris Bueller's Great Day Off? Did you ever watch that?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when Ferris looks right into the camera and he starts talking to you, and it's like this moment where the movie sort of reveals itself as being a movie. The illusion is broken. The fourth wall is broken. Trompe l'oeil painting is a bit like breaking the fourth wall. You know, the painting is sort of looking at you straight in the eye and saying, I am actually a painting. Let's talk about what painting is, what illusion is, what's real and what's not real. So yes, it is a lie, but a noble lie, a noble way of telling the truth.
Thank you for reminding me of Ferris Bueller, because I just love that moment in that bit, I think, where he says, you know, you lick your palms. I know it's childish, but so's school. So I love that bit.
It's such a good movie.
It's great. I was slightly worried you were going to reference an Ingmar Bergman film or something, but no, it was a John Hughes film. That you found the
Remain
level
calm,
there.
everyone.
It's okay.
Do you have an ejector seat button for that, do you, or something?
It's funny. One of my favourite comedians, Stuart Lee, is always talking about the Brechtian theatre of alienation, and that is why he does what he does, where it's drawing attention to the artifice of stand-up comedy, and. Is that what is it about that particular approach with painting that really appeals to you?
There's a curious thing.
What does it do?
Yeah, painting is both artifice, and artifact, if we can think about it in those terms. So so it's both an object, a thing that exists in the world. If you come to an exhibition, you look at a painting, it's not just a surface, a picture. It's got sides and it's got three-dimensionality about it. It's a thing that exists in the world. But at the same time, it's a little bit like, well, Matisse described painting as a window to another world, and the frame of the painting is a little bit like looking through a window to see something that isn't there beyond. Or to put it another way, what is painting but an accumulation of carbon and material and smelly pigments smeared across a canvas? But on another hand, it's a coming together of philosophies and ideas and questions that are sort of embodied in the materials and in the canvas. So I quite like that idea that painting sort of flits, kind of oscillates between being an artifact and artifice. And in some ways, it's a little bit creation-y as well, if I can sort of jump straight into that when we look to creation, creation revealing God's character, the invisible things of God's character are revealed through his creation. So when I look at my studio, I see my pear tree in the garden, and that pear tree is stuff, it's material, and it's wood, but it's also telling me invisible things about the character and the greatness of God. And I think in a way, paintings work a bit like that in a human sense. They are both material, but they also reveal these things that exist in another kind of invisible way.
You tell a
Can I ask a question
go on.
about, just before we get into more biblical stuff, I think, which would be helpful, and we'll talk about your book, Why Art Matters. I was just going to ask you a question about how you would like your work to be enjoyed, because I think we get the clear sense that our listeners generally are fairly reformed Christian in some way, typically as a tradition not pro-art, fine art particularly, but that lots of our listeners are. And so speaking as someone, for example, if I've sweated over a sitcom script and then people just say, oh, I love your show, I often have it on in the background. Or occasionally for my radio stuff, oh, I often fall asleep to your shows on Radio 4 Extra, which in some ways is very flattering. And I know that that's not necessarily what they mean by it, but how can you help us, those of us who want to enjoy and appreciate art better? Let's say I'm going to a city museum of art, which will involve art from the last, 300 years, maybe 500-600 years. I'm not really expecting to like all of it. I think that's probably okay. Could you just give us maybe a few top tips about, you've got 90 minutes in an art gallery, try this as a way of getting something out of it other than I liked that one and I didn't like that one, which is a start. But how would you advise people to consume what you're doing?
I guess as a start, it's not a bad start. Personal opinion is important, and if your starting point is, do I like it? Well, fantastic. And then the next question was, what do you like about it? Maybe it reminds you of somewhere you grew up, or it poses a question to you that's challenging or encouraging. And we surround ourselves with things that we like. I think it was A.L. Kennedy, the comedian, who said that we generally surround ourselves with things that remind us of what it means to be human, things that give us dignity, things that tell us that we value, that we have power, and in our home we surround ourselves with things that we like. But that's not to say that they're all good, or that they make some important point or raise some important question. And so maybe to go beyond the personal, to ask questions like, well, what is this artist attempting to say? And is what they're saying actually matched up with what I am hearing? That might be one thing. Another thing might be, well, what does this remind me of? Does it remind me of other painters? Does it remind me of a moment in history? Does it remind me of another cultural tradition? Does it bring to mind a certain philosophical question? And that might be as significant as some existential question about who we are, life, the universe, and everything. Or it might be that the artist is trying to say, hey, look at how beautiful rain looks when the sun falls in it, or doesn't that building look amazing, even though it's concrete, now that it's got bits of plants growing up it? It can be as simple as that. So, I think it's important to ask the personal questions, but also to ask how the artwork fits in the wider canon of the art world, perhaps why it's been put in the museum. If you go to a public museum, the thing's probably been curated so that you've got a conversation between lots of different artworks. So you might ask, well, that painting that I'm drawn to, why have they put that next to that sculpture? Or why is it next to that film over there? Are they telling me that all connects in some way, like they're having a conversation with one another? What might that conversation be? So, I guess some introductory questions like that would probably help.
And in a way, that's how we read Scripture, is we tend to atomise Scripture and go, well, what does this parable mean? But then there's well, why is it next to that parable? And why is it after that event? And what is the context for this?
Yes.
And in a way, maybe we sort of slightly rob things of their context. We stand in front of a painting and expect something to happen. And it's well, this feels like you've raised the bar pretty high for what you're expecting paint on a canvas to do, which sometimes these great works really do transcend absolutely everything. But that's kind of fairly rare, isn't it? Barry, what do you like in an art gallery? Are you sort of give everything 3 seconds, move on?
No, I feel awkward the way I felt awkward when I went to the Grand Canyon, which is that you go and you're staggered by the beauty, but then a little voice in my head says, all right, how long do I need to stand here before I can move on so that I don't look like a complete peasant? That's kind of what's going through my head a lot of the time. But yes, there have definitely been times where I've been wonderfully wrong-footed by some of my favourite pieces of art. For a long time, I was a huge fan of the Edward Hopper painting, Nighthawks. I mean, it's probably banal to a lot of people because it's so well known. But then it was showing in Chicago, where I was studying, and I went to the gallery and was staggered to see that the actual painting itself was about 20 times smaller than the one I had on my wall. And it was, tiny little thing. And it was just extraordinary to sort of get really close to it and see
that is
the
really
detail.
Surprising because it's like a huge window of a diner sort of thing, isn't it? In terms of its so in your head, it's probably 5 feet
Well, it was
high.
it was the one I had on my wall in my bedroom, which was in this huge, great big frame. It was probably, this thing was probably 4.5 feet across. It was huge.
It's the same with the Mona Lisa, isn't it? I think Mona Lisa is a lot smaller than you.
It's pretty small.
And in a way, this kind of takes us on to, perception and reality, because I think I ended up writing an episode of a sitcom which ended up having the Mona Lisa in it, or a famous painting in it. And when the props department produced a copy of this thing, it was like, it's too small. that prop's not going to work. That's how big it actually is. Can we get a bigger one? But okay, so it's like, because in this sitcom situation, it's not the fact that the moment it looks small, it's now drawing attention to the fact that it's smaller than I thought, and that's not going to work for us. The idea is that he's actually got the original Mona Lisa, so can we just have a bigger one, please?
Right, so you're it's a lie that seems true.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Maybe,
that needs to be framed in a certain way for people to accept it as true. Yeah.
It maybe spins
That's
in the way that we expect images to function. You know, that when you saw the painting, the Edward Hopper painting, I imagine you maybe thought it was kind of cinematic because of the way that the light functions in that painting. And I know it really well. It's such a great painting. It's one of my favourites too, actually. And the way that the light comes in from outside the diner, it's like you're looking at a Wim Wenders movie or something like that. And,
yes.
And of course, normally we'd see that on a huge screen, or even at home on the TV. Right. Most of us now have a TV screen that's bigger than Edward Hopper's actual painting.
Yes.
You know, John Burge used to write about this. You know, he used to write about the way that we see things, that classic book ways of seeing that we all had to read in art school. He describes how paintings get turned into reproductions, and then the reproductions get turned into things like T-shirts and umbrellas, and so you know, you get an umbrella with a Monet water lily painting on it, and you think you've seen Monet's water lily painting because you've got an umbrella with it on, but then you go and see it in the Musée d'Orsay, and you realise it's enormous. You know, it's kind of cinematic, and you know, I guess that's partly how visual culture works. We have certain expectations for what images should do, depending on the context in which we first see them. But a lot of that alludes to how we understand artworks, not just in the way we think about them, if I can say this, but it's more about the way that we feel about artworks, you know, that kind of elusive quality of our affections towards things. And you'd feel things by looking at that Edward Hopper painting that would be different when you saw it actually in real life, in the same way that I might stand in front of the Mona Lisa and feel something that I can't quite put into words. And that feels different to when I look at it on a postcard, or when I'm standing in front of it at the Louvre with usually there's about 400 people surrounding it.
Yes, and there's a little red rope sort of that's just in front of it, and
the thing is, Ali, we're Reformed Christians, so we don't feel anything.
Oh yeah, it's
and if we do feel something and we can't put it into words, then we haven't felt it, because words encapsulate all meaning. And I guess that's a segue into why you wrote your book, why you felt the need to write a book called Why Art Matters, because there would be some people of our age who would not call themselves Christians, or would be different kinds of Christians, who would say, well, of course art matters. Who on earth needs convincing that art matters? Well, people who read books published by IVP probably need reminding of that. Do you want to say a bit about how that book came about?
Yeah, in some ways I did wonder if I was preaching to the converted. If you're picking up a book called Why Art Matters, the chances are you probably think it matters enough to read a book about it. So in a way, it's both a book it's a book for Christians, it's a book for artists, it's a book for anyone who engages with visual culture, and that's all of us, you know. But it's also the kind of book you might want to pass on to that Reformed evangelical friend who maybe asks, well, you know, why do pictures really matter? Give me the word, brother. Give me the word. Why pictures? So it started with that, but also it was out of conversations that happened a couple of years ago, and you know, I was at a party with fellow artists and curators, and it was just as things about pandemic were beginning to reveal themselves, you know, and somebody there said that people are going to lose their lives over this, and they're going to lose their jobs, and the world's going to fall apart. You know, why in this environment does art matter? You know, can a painting find a cure for coronavirus, or can a play bring an end to the problems that we now face in distributing the vaccine around the place? And if we think about art in purely utilitarian terms, then, you know, of course, no, it can't. Art serves no function there at all. And it just, you know, it struck me how often particularly in Reformed circles, of which I am one. I am part of that gang. I am Reformed and evangelical. But how often...
What went wrong? How did you become an artist? It's amazing.
Yes.
I'm glad you did, but yeah.
Yes, yeah. Which part of the manual did I miss out when I went to...
You had the map upside down and you ended up in the wrong meeting, and there we go.
Yes.
But sorry, interrupted
left
you.
when it should have gone right at theological training. And
There was a trompe l'oeil, which gave you the impression it's through this door, and the door wasn't real.
That's right. Come through this one instead. Smack, as I walked into a wall. But really, it came out of conversations like that about what purpose art has, what function art might serve. And actually, art does serve function. It has utilitarian function. There's strong argument for a more robust economy when artists are active. One can have conversations with those in the medical profession, particularly those within mental health worlds, who'll talk about the function of art as a means to bring about restoration. But I just thought there hadn't really been much written from the perspective not just of someone who's a Reformed Christian, but also someone who actually is an artist, about what the Bible says about art, which is loads. I mean, the Bible's brimming with ideas and information about creativity and the creative arts. And I'd read various texts written by theologians or by writers, but I hadn't really found anything that I thought landed sweetly by someone who was an artist and, makes the stuff. So I came in from that perspective as a painter.
It works for me. One of the things I really appreciated about it was that I've read a lot of books, effectively apologia for art, which run to 300, 400, 500 pages. And one of the things I love about your book is it's really distilled. You've clearly spent a lot of time thinking about it. Here's the cover, by the way, folks. It's on my iPad. I hope this shows up. And by the way, that brings me to another thing I was going to ask you. Is I was going to advise people to definitely get the book, but don't get it on Kindle, because the design of the book is such, as you might expect from a book from Ali, is that it's got wonderful pictures of art in it, your own artwork, which illustrates as we go through. And I guess you don't get that in the Kindle edition,
No,
or it's in black and white, or it's kind of hard to see. I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the Kindle version of this? Is it an abomination? Have you seen it?
I'm going to admit I've not actually seen the Kindle version of it yet. I don't actually own a Kindle. Is that terrible to say these days?
No, this is interesting. I mean, is the reason you don't own a Kindle because you find it hard to read things in that medium, or is there another reason?
It could be part of it. I just never made the switch. I mean, I am dyslexic, like a lot of artists. The book took a lot of time to get out because I write very, very, very slowly. And that might be part of it, but I never made the transition over. I guess I'm one of those oldies who kind of still likes the feel of the paper and the materiality of the book and having a thing. And I kind of like at the end of it to put it on my bookshelf so that, people can come around. We all do this and go, oh, look at all the books in my bookshelf, And it's not quite the same, is it? Whopping out your Kindle and saying, look at the library.
It's not.
I've never heard it called whopping out your Kindle before, but
yes.
that's true. There's an element of trophies about books as well, but that's not I'm sure not the fundamental reason to own them and buy them.
Because also reasons too.
A book called Why Art Matters should be probably read with the pictures that are there.
It does.
So,
it does.
I mean,
help,
what are they? What are their? So, give us one of the kind of the main thrusts of the book. Why does art matter?
Yeah, well, I talk about how art matters because humans matter, and art is the voice of the human spirit. So it begins by looking at how all human beings are made in the image of God, and as such, to be creative, to make things, and particularly to make things well, is simply part of what it means to be a human being. And from there, we look at some art, work together. We look at Christians of faith in the past. We look at how art is a form of lament, how it might find a colour that expresses our mourning, or just the right words to articulate our grief. There's some stuff in there about beauty, about why beauty matters, a word that isn't really bounced around all that much I think, in evangelical circles. It's a little bit problematic in contemporary art as well, for various reasons that we could get into. But beauty...
Well, why don't we? Let's get into it.
I was going to say, I'd love to get into that, because one of the things that really struck me as I read it was that question, does perceived beauty determine what is true? Or does truth determine what is beautiful? That seems to be at the heart of the debate, and the former seems to rule at present. This Netflix series, or this piece of art, or this sculpture, or this poem seems beautiful to me, strikes me as beautiful. Therefore, it's true. We might say true with a small t, but that's what we would say. Whereas the latter, that idea of truth determining what is beautiful, seems to be maybe it isn't a distinctively Christian approach to aesthetics, is it, would you say?
If we were to land this a couple of centuries upstream, ideas of truth and beauty would really be synonymous with one another. When one talked about a beautiful landscape, you were talking about something that was good or something that was true. In fact, if we think about it through the lens of Scripture, when the word beauty appears, we have that translated as one word in most English translations, but like so many Hebrew and Greek words, the word beautiful, there's so many different words that are just translated as beautiful. And in Scripture, one of the ways of translating beauty is how we see it today, something that is pleasing to the eye, beautiful in that way. But more often, beauty is to do with character or to do with truth. Like when Esther is described as a beautiful person, and it's not just because of the way she looked, it's because she has a beautiful character. Or when the prophet Isaiah writes, how beautiful on the mountain are the feet of those who bring good news. It's not about the aesthetic quality of their feet, although I'm sure they had very nice shoes while they were walking. It was about the message that they brought the redemptive message being a beautiful message. And, historically, most traditions of visual art would put beauty and truth, and interestingly, justice, in a league with one another. When one thinks of the classical traditions, for example, think of a beautiful Corinthian temple that's very symmetrical, and everything just works and has the right sense of order about it. Things being ordered, things being harmonious, ergo were things that were good, that just functioned well in the world. Or if we fast forward, a Dionysian tradition would kind of think the opposite, that beautiful is sort of the negation of order, the fly in the ointment. And that leads us to thinking about how things that feel good are beautiful, So the blind abandonment of rules, the negation of rules, just to go and have a fantastic time, feels beautiful. The idea of beauty is just so complex now and nuanced, because the traditions of beauty have changed. The kind of the goalposts have moved so much through history that we reach ourselves at a point when we have, kind of things like, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and whatever you think is beautiful is fine, whatever I think is beautiful is fine, and we'll just agree to disagree with one another. But historically, that wouldn't have been the case. Beauty was more of an absolute order than it is today.
And yet, even in Scripture itself, there's almost the recognition that beauty can be quite a slippery concept, because I was thinking of, as I was reading your book, the chapter that came to mind was Isaiah 53, where you have that extraordinary line about Christ. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. And yet, of course, we know as believers Christ is the apotheosis, that should be the word of the podcast, is the apotheosis of beauty. So it seems to me the Scripture's deliberately drawing our attention there to the fact that when it says no beauty that we should desire him, it's not saying that Christ isn't beautiful, but it is saying that he's not beautiful in the sense that you might be thinking. He's not beautiful in perhaps the conventional idea of what might be considered beautiful. So again, it's drawing our hearts, trying to woo our hearts towards a beauty which is sometimes hidden. And that, of course, is one of the great themes of your book, that art, as it were, cleans the window so that we can actually see clearly what beauty really is. And it may be a very unexpected thing. It might be something that most people would consider ugly, but just drawing people's attention to that beauty. But yeah, that's really helpful stuff.
The other image that came to mind as you were saying about pleasing to the eye, obviously, how can you... What immediately comes to mind when you talk about something being pleasing to the eye? You're thinking of
Genesis.
You're thinking of Genesis and the Garden of Eden. But as you were also talking about order and all those sorts of things, it was just making me think of there was a beautiful order to creation, and actually the fruit itself was beautiful. The tree was beautiful. I'm sure eventually we would have been permitted to eat from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, so the fruit would of course be beautiful. But we were not patient. We didn't want to wait. We were disordered. So our desires were disordered, and our desire was the problem, rather than the thing itself, which was obviously extremely beautiful.
It's interesting that God even declares of those trees, Genesis 2, that they are pleasing to the eye. Before actually he says they're good for food. The way that they looked. Is noted before their kind of function is declared. And then, kind of interestingly, after the fall, when Eve reflects back on the trees, she says, "Oh, they're good for food, and they're pleasing to the eye." It's as if something happened at the fall that sort of switched the order of creation, and that things that were esteemed for how pleasant they were to look at. They kind of switched, and their utility somehow became more important. I mean, one can read too much into that, I think, but...
No, well, I don't know. Because then that order, and especially that Edenic order, refers back to is referred back to in the tabernacle and in the temple and in the Ark of the Covenant and in the instructions that Moses is given. So we shouldn't be surprised when... we see that order coming through, and that ugliness is actually disorder, which would kind of be a bit more of a classical approach to it, maybe.
Yes, in a classical sense, yeah. And we see that, of course, in the development of creation itself. As we read the account of Genesis 1, how creation is rendered through a series of days, and God returns on day 3 back to the stuff that he made on day 1 to make it more interesting and nuanced and complex. On day 1 he creates night and day, and then on day 3 he comes back and he puts the sun there and he puts the stars there to kind of enrich it and make it more complex and more interesting. I find it intriguing that creation doesn't arrive like a flat pack, from IKEA. It doesn't come fully formed. It comes through a process, through an ordered process of rendering until it reaches its crowning glory on day 6. And then there's this wonderful rest, this sort of continuation of creation through rest. But there's order, or maybe rhythm might be another way of talking about it. It's as if to say if something's not ordered, then it's not beautiful. And, there can be great beauty in the disorder and in those little niggles and the things that aren't quite symmetrical, that there can be really beautiful things happening with that too.
I've been really immersing myself in a lot of C.S. Lewis recently, and even just the basic Narnia books as well. I'm going back and rereading them to my kids whilst I still have the chance. And there's such a strong sense of order in Narnia, and the importance and oughtness of order, and that when things are disordered, things are unhappy, things go wrong, and actually when things are reordered, Lewis and Tolkien to some extent, they spend quite a long time there enjoying the sense of order, and that order has been restored, and this is where true joy can be found. I've always thought that's kind of an interesting thing, because with my sitcom brain on, the moment the climax has happened, you got 90 seconds and get out, because we're done. The tension has been released, and so standing around and saying, well, that just about wraps it up, isn't isn't terribly interesting or funny, but it is joyful. But that doesn't kind of quite sit with the sitcom genre. But Barry, you've been digging around a bit of C.S. Lewis as well, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I was reading an essay of his, or rather, it was a talk I think he gave to the Socratic Society. It was in 1944, called "Is Theology Poetry?" That wasn't the title that he gave it himself. That was the title he was assigned to speak on. And his point there is exactly the point you make, which is that whatever is truly true is of necessity beautiful and good. But he does make the point that there are things, he refers to pagan myths, for example, which of course he was a big fan of in their way. He says there are things like pagan myths that have a certain beauty to them without being true. So you can have beauty without truth, but you can't have true truth without it being beautiful. Do you think maybe that sort of pivots us into an area where a lot of Christians have questions, which is, well, is it valid? Is it even a good thing? Is it a helpful thing to be looking for the beauty in, let's say, the latest artwork by Tracy Emin, or somebody who is quite iconoclastic about art itself? What do you think on that? How should Christians approach that kind of art?
Yes, I think if we reduce beauty to something that makes us feel pleasant, something that kind of makes us feel a little bit warm and nice about ourselves, then we're going to have a really hard time with a lot of contemporary artwork, and for that matter, a lot of historical artwork that could be beautifully rendered and comes with a horrific message. But if we think about beauty in terms of things that are good or things that are true or even things that are just, then I suppose there's a lot that we can say about Tracy Emin. She reveals the world to us exactly as she sees it. And we might not agree with the way that she sees the world or even like the way that she sees the world. But the fact that she's revealing it honestly, there's a lot of beauty in that. So I believe that I can understand more about Tracy Emin and I can relate to her and others like her through seeing her artwork. Anyway, it's a little bit like sitting down with a friend and having a difficult conversation where a friend reveals something about them that might be surprising or shocking, and you have a closer affinity with them because of that. And you walk away and you go, oh, that was just really beautiful. And you're not saying that situation that you're in is beautiful, but the fact that we have revealed something truthfully, that is really beautiful. Maybe it spins back to... bad as you're talking about the beauty of Christ, and we sing that there was nothing about his presence, his physical presence, that was beautiful, but yet we sing of him, he is the beautiful Saviour. And we sing that because, well, what's beautiful? It's the redemptive work of the cross, the truth of the cross. That is the beautiful thing. So I can reflect on a pretty horrific image of a man exposed, dying cruelly on a cross, and see great beauty in that, because I see a truthful, redemptive action within that, and not to compare Tracy Emin's artwork to the cross, but there's something of a similar revealing of something that is real and truthful that actually is very beautiful.
Tom Holland does a great job in Dominion. I haven't finished it yet because it's quite hard to read, but the first chapter or two about the actual crucifixion and just the sheer ugliness of the whole thing and the shamefulness of it and how it was sort of tucked away and the violence of it, I thought was really something that Christians tend to miss, because in a way we see the beauty of the cross now too easily, because the cross is always a positive symbol of hope, of aid, of salvation, of medical care, of all these other things. And although the Red Cross don't see themselves as a Christian organisation, they went with a cross nonetheless, because of the evocative image. And as you were talking now, I was just thinking of comedy, which I approach in a similar way, is often troubling or difficult. But when it works because it's true. And so a comedian may be saying things that are difficult, humiliating, stuff we'd rather not talk about. it's only funny if it's true. If it's made up, if it's nonsense, then it just doesn't land. And so when Barry's favourite comedian, Stuart Lee, does weird things in the room by alienating the audience, and I've been there where, as he's basically said to the audience, look, half of you aren't going to like this because you came with a friend and they didn't basically tell you what I'm like. And some of you came because it's the local theatre and you wanted to support it. And these people at the front here are going to really like it because they bought their tickets first. So, and you're going to find how much they like it quite annoying after a while. And he's just saying all of these things that are true. But also you're screaming, why are you telling us these things? You're just making it even more awkward. But the fact that he's doing it is just so deliciously truthful. I think maybe that's one of the appeals. Is that what you're thinking, Barry, when you're listening to Stuart Lee or watching him?
Yeah, I think it is a big element of, there is a big element of that, but it's also working on the other level of he's deliberately painting himself in an unflattering light, which is enjoyable. He's got a sort of a Stuart Lee character that is this I'm better than you sort of person. And there's just something intrinsically funny about somebody saying that out loud. I'm clearly better than you, you know.
Yeah, because
funny.
He would say, I don't think that I'm better than you, but also we know he kind of does think he's better than us because he's read more books and he also likes, you know, classical French clowning or Italian, you know, you know what I mean?
Yes.
He's got that very educated image about him.
Yeah.
So
and
the
he
Tracy
also has
Emin
the self-awareness.
stuff is similar.
I was reading the Silmarillion during the first lockdown. You know, when we all sort of dusted down.
Whoa, well done.
Well, I'd like to say I finished it, James, but I said I was reading it. I'm not entirely sure I've yet finished it. It was one of those books that, you know, I've always wanted to read, and I dusted down, and I guess we all thought, wow, all that time I'm going to have to read. I'll read the Silmarillion. But I got as far as the creation myth, and it's really interesting reading Tolkien's creation story, particularly in light of C.S. Lewis's creation story, because they're quite different myths in a way. And if you know the Silmarillion, you'll know that the is it Iluvatar, is it the great divine being? He creates these angelic beings who essentially make creation by singing creation out. So it's a bit like Aslan, you know, singing out, and Narnia sort of crops up from the ground. And as they sing, things and stuff come into the world, and it's very beautiful music. But then one of these angelic beings decides to sing out a really discordant harmony. He puts the fly in the ointment. And the other angelic beings go, hang on, what's with that? It sounds bad, you know, it's discordant. And what you might expect the divine being to do is to press rewind and replay, or abort, let's stop that, and let's do something else again. But he allows Melkor's discordant harmony to infiltrate into the beautiful harmony of the other beings. And what we have is this discordant yet harmonious tension that creates beautiful creation. And one needs to be a little bit careful. I don't think Tolkien was advocating a divine being that introduces evil into the world so that we can understand good. I think that probably takes the conversation in another place. But rather, Melkor introduces discord with harmony, and the two are interwoven with one another. And I think that's a really fascinating way of seeing creation. And to me, that kind of works. That works with my experience of the creation, that there can be great beauty in discord, and there can be great harmony, even in things that are awful and ugly. You know, otherwise, how can we go through a painful experience, yet be renewed and restored through it? Or how can we listen to a work that is a lament, and yet come away feeling lifted and invigorated by it? And I wonder if it's less helpful to think about beauty in dichotomous terms. In other words, to think things that are nice, pretty, lovely, beautiful are good, and things that are horrific or make us feel bad, ergo, are bad. But actually to think through our understanding of the world is more integrated than that. We live in this tension, this kind of tension of harmony and discord. And for me, the most interesting paintings, and I wonder if this comes back to what you're saying, James, about how comedy works as well. The most interesting art seems to be the art that lands in that tension, that kind of gets it and reflects the reality of this broken, discordant world for what it is.
Yeah. There's a truth to that. There's a power to that truth. Barry and I, some years ago, came across the comedian Bill Burr, and there's a very funny routine where he talks in a room full of very well-educated, wealthy New Yorkers about basically what a complete con the iPhone is, and that and that Steve Jobs is just like, I don't get it. He changed the world. No, he didn't. He sort of, and the way, and he's sort of saying all this stuff about Apple that we know to be true. But he paints himself as the kind of slightly uncultured idiot, even though what he's saying is true. And in a way, there is a harmony, there's a discordantness, and it's a bit like the Threepenny Opera, isn't it? Which kind of sounds the Kurt Weill kind of stuff, which sounds sad and optimistic at the same time, and it's got it's all that stuff going on. I have no idea what I'm talking about, Barry. Why don't you say something that's coherent?
Well, I was going to say,
useful?
I think what's interesting about what Bill Burr does, again, and it's very much like what Stuart Lee does, kind of undercutting himself by poking fun at himself as the kind of rube in the room, is that, back to Lewis, he's understood instinctively that in order for truth to land, you've got to steal past the watchful dragons. So you've got to get people's defences to come down. And the way he gets people's defences to come down is to say, look at me, I'm just an idiot, what do I know? But he's saying all these true things, and people are laughing at the true things and accepting the true things as true because he's not a threat to them in that sense. And I wonder if that's one of the real strengths of art, is that it, like it did with me, in Chicago, it just catches you unawares. It asks you questions and challenges you in ways that you're not expecting to be challenged necessarily. One of the things that got me about Nighthawks when I really spent time looking at it up close is, what actually are these people doing in here? It's supposed to be, it looks vaguely like a coffee bar, but where's all the equipment? Like, this seems very sparse. Like, is it actually a coffee bar, or are these people actually, are they really aware of each other? And it's that sort of thing that makes art, gives art its
is it not a coffee
its
bar?
lasting relevance, right? Sorry?
Yeah. Is it not a coffee bar?
There's like a little silver sort of decanter at the back. I don't know what you call it. But there's kind of nothing else. You don't see a bunch of plates or cups sitting around.
We've just filled in all of that
detail. It's really, really sparse, and there's a weird sort of disconnection that's happening in that room. The person who's ostensibly supposed to be serving is miles away and not looking at people. There's just all that kind of stuff. And I think that this is one of the real strengths of art, as opposed to what we tend to want to do as reform people, which is fill in all the blanks. When you do that, you leave nowhere for the imagination to run, nowhere for the imagination to grow. And I think our souls kind of shrink, really, as a result. And so I love that great art has that ability to ask questions without, and feeling quite comfortable about posing questions and not answering them. I'm pretty sure if you asked Edward Hopper, what's that all about? What's actually going on? He'd say, I'm not going to tell you that.
Yes.
That's sort of the point.
It'd be so good.
David Lynch is the same. I've seen him interviewed when they say, why did you frame the shot like that? Why does that character do this? And he's like, is it because of this? And he's like, no, but maybe it is. I don't know. It's like, it's like, stop being so obtuse. It's like, no, that's the whole point. That's why he chose to create this thing, not so that he could then answer questions so that you could fill in the gaps, but so that you would have to really inhabit it. You'd have to enter into it. You'd have to sit in the discomfort of it a little bit. It does something to our souls, which is really good, in much the same way as the ineffable does in Scripture.
Yes.
I mean, who can possibly come to terms with what was going on the cross? Who can possibly come to terms with what it meant to say, Why have you forsaken me? Things like that. They pose all sorts of questions which much bigger minds than mine have tried to wrestle with for 2,000 years, and with varying degree, probably not much success. And that's good. That's a good thing. We're not meant to be able to get on top of these things. Sorry, this has turned into a real rant, isn't it?
I'm with you, though, really, Barry, completely with you. One of the questions I'm often asked in art gallery, and most often by Christian mates than none, knowing that I'm an artist, is, can you explain that to me? Or what does that mean? And my stomach always sinks when I hear that question, So I think, well, if I could reduce it to 3 or 4 sentences in words, then I'm not sure I'm doing Edward Hopper any favourites. He saw the best way to articulate this idea was with this painting. So I tend to sort of duck the question and say, well, why don't we just stand in front of this painting or sit for 5 minutes, set your timer, and just look at it and think about it and feel it, and try not to let your head think about what's happening for dinner later on or the emails that you need to answer, but, be present with the artwork. And I think, especially in the evangelical world, we get itchy around that. We want the explanations. I think we want things to be clear. Paul prayed that his preaching, he asked us to pray that his preaching would be clear, and rightly so with evangelistic preaching. But I'm not sure Paul meant that for every form of communication in the world ad infinitum. And one stands in front of a great work by Mark Rothko, for example, the great abstract painter. And if you ask Mark, what does that mean? I think he would probably slap you in the face. His works are effective. They allow the imagination to ponder. And, we get a bit nervous sometimes about talking about the imagination because it sounds a bit mysterious or that we can't quite trust it. But I would argue differently. I would argue for a really robust Christian apologetic of imagination, almost to dare I say it, to reclaim a Christian imagination. I
think one of the problems is we keep fighting the wars of the past, like now. So Reformed folk are often trying to fight 14th century Catholicism. We don't want to worship statues, do we, etc. And so we've got the legacy of whitewashed churches which have no art in them. But there's also, we're fighting the post-structuralists who say that authorial intent is meaningless, and therefore the Bible is meaningless because the people who wrote it had, whatever, even if they meant anything by writing it, not only can you not know what that was, but there's no meaning to knowing what that was. And so in order to reclaim meaning, it feels like we have to say, well, this painting must have a meaning. And that if the artist has a series of statements in his head or her head, and she has painted this, and I have to work out what those statements are, and then I've cracked it, and I've worked out the meaning. And if the artist says to me, I don't even know what this means, we'll say either you're lying or you're not very good at it. Because it's got to mean something. What do you mean you painted it and not know what it means? Why did you do that? And so, and I think, well, that has to be wrong. But I haven't quite filled that with what it could be right about that. Can you help me out there?
Well, I wonder when we look at the sunset, if we get the similar hang-up and say, well, what does that mean? Can you explain the setting sun?
Yeah.
And, I mean, we can go, the heavens declare the glory of God, so it means God is glorious. Or we think Romans, that God reveals himself, his invisible attributes, so that men are without excuse. So it means there is wrath as well as glory. But there's so much more than that. What does it mean? Well, I'm to sit and be held by the sunset. I don't need to have a 3-point explanation for it in order to engage with the sunset. And, I kind of like the way that Augustine used to write about it. He talked about how we feel our way around the world more than we actually think our way around the world. And I think that's kind of true, actually. When I think about how my day has gone today, I dropped my daughter at school this morning, I drove her to school this morning, and when I got in the car, I didn't think about which road I was going to take, or I couldn't tell you the name of the roads. I couldn't tell you which gear I was in for most of it. You know, I kind of intuited my way.
Were you drunk, Ali?
No.
Is that what it was?
Caveats. Yeah.
I've driven across the neighbour's garden again.
You
high
saw
on
how I
paint
was
fumes
driving this
again,
morning. Yes, quick caveat, I hadn't been drinking. I wasn't under the influence of any other things. But it's a little bit like when you brush your teeth as well. You know, you don't need to think about why you brush your teeth, you just do it. But you've built up an intuitive memory of how you feel your way around about the world. We do it when we drive, we do it when we brush our teeth, we do it in most things in life. We have this sort of built-up intuition. And the intuition, I think, is intrinsically connected with our imagination. You know, it's how we see things beyond what we actually know to be true. And in our Reformed circles, we put such great stock on the importance of worldview and how we think. You know, don't be conformed to the pattern of this world, but transformed by the renewing of the mind is often the verse that is cited, but we forget that Paul's writing to a culture whose idea of the mind is really different from our idea of the mind. It's not just ration and reason. It's also feeling and emotion, and intuition and imagination. It's a pre-enlightened idea of what the mind is. Even to say that, a pre-enlightened idea of what the mind is. You know, so when the mind is renewed, in Paul's sense, I think it's more than just the facts and figures and the reason and the rationale. It's also, I think, the feel, the intuition, the emotion, and key, the imagination.
Yeah, there is something we murder to dissect, don't we? My daughter's currently going through a riff of, as I guess a lot of 3-year-olds do, of just saying why to everything. It's like almost compulsive. Why? Well, why is that man doing that? Well, because he's doing this. Well, why? Well, because that's important. Why? And eventually you're just like, just enjoy the fact that this is happening. It's okay, you know. And she's yet to get to that point where she can just accept it. Now, you can go a long way down that why road. I can keep answering her questions for the most part. But there comes a certain point where you sort of hit the bedrock. And it's like, just because this is the world the Lord has given us and we're to rejoice and be glad in it, you know. It's pretty much it. So I've got another listener question here. Let me just throw this one out to you. This should
probably be our last one before we wrap things up and hop over onto Patreon. But let's have it.
So here's this listener question. What do you think about?
I didn't realise that.
Maybe no. So what do you think about religious icons? In brackets, he said, this is Josh. I love them, despite once believing they were veiled idolatry. So what do you think about religious icons?
Thanks, Josh. I love them too, and particularly the Orthodox icons. There's such a rich painterly tradition with them. I love the way that they articulated facial features to emphasise characteristics like truthfulness and wisdom. And I think like so much within creation, there's so much good and there's so much fall and brokenness as well. And yes, I get that in some circles, some icons were used to be items of worship in themselves, to bow down and worship the icon more so than worshipping Christ. And let's fight that with every bone in our body. But not all icons work in that way. In fact, most didn't. You know, most were a signifier to point towards the true icon, which is Christ, the icon of Jesus. So I tread a little lightly because I know that blood has been spilt over this issue, and others greater than I will have different views on this to me. But I enjoy and I love the visual tradition of those, particularly the Orthodox icons, even if I'm still trying to work out what's happening with them theologically.
It's very helpful. James?
I like the 2D aesthetic. I find the 3D Roman Catholic icons that are often painted, and you get them in European churches, I find them creepy, and I don't know why. I think it's because they are quite lifelike, but that they're quite an odd size, aren't they? They're kind of they're sort of like half height of people. Yeah. And I don't know why. Maybe it's the, what's that?
The uncanny valley.
Go on.
The uncanny valley.
The uncanny valley. This is an expression I only came across relatively recently, and now I keep hearing it and then forgetting it clearly. But yeah, there's an uncanny valley about those like oh, look, here's a 3-foot-tall statue of John the Baptist, and it's all painted, and his skin colour is, so it's like, oh, it feels like it's going to start moving. Not in a good way.
Well, some of those Catholic icons, particularly coming out of the Spanish kingdoms, would emphasise beauty as being hyper-real. So if something is more real than real, it had a heightened sense of spiritual reality. So a sculpture of a saint who looks incredibly realistic, but 3 times bigger, is even more real. The trouble is, we think of Madame Tussauds and strange theme parks now when we think about that sort of visual vocabulary, and it kind of freaks us out a little bit. But that might...
I like the Dutch realism stuff, but that's more of a tableau scene, isn't it, rather than... It's not particularly in your face, it's much more sort of set back. It's like you're, peering in through a window almost on this sort of snapshot of life.
Well, listen, folks, if you would like more of Ali, and quite frankly, why wouldn't you? Episodes 22 and 23, The Art is Fine and Prone to Moan, they are available if you are a patron. If people wanted to become a patron of the arts, James, what would they do? Specifically, our art. That really is overstating it, isn't it? But
so of our art, they could join us on Patreon, which gets you all the back episodes, and also you can join our Discord, which is a chat. It's pretty much how you had hoped social media would turn out to be, but wasn't. But it is, in our case, it's a friendly bunch of people asking lots of questions like this. But also, if you want to be a patron of the arts, you should also buy Ali's book. Buy the hard copy, and it's called Why Art Matters, and it's published by IVP, and Barry is holding up a copy there, and there are links to that in the show notes too. So do get hold of that. And also, Ali, you've got a website which kind of is a bit more of a professional shop window on where you are.
That's right.
Although you can't actually buy your works directly through that because you tend to exhibit in galleries.
I do.
Where do we go for that?
It's really easy to find. It's just my name, AlastairJohnGordon.com.
AlastairJohnGordon.com. Brilliant. I think we're done. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Cooper and T, how